Okay, we're at the final unit of the final handout in the class now, and we've looked at quantity sensitive stress now in Latin, in Arabic, in Klamath, and now we come to the last language, English. And here's my take on English stress. It is a total mess. English stress is very noisy and variable and hard to characterize. And there are basically two kinds of people in phonology. There are people who believe that English stress is rule based with a lot of abstract rules and hidden structures and maybe some exceptions and counterexamples and elaborations. And those who believe that English stress is fundamentally unpredictable and memorized in the lexicon. And so I'm sort of making a joke here about the two kinds of people in phonology, but actually not entirely. So opinions on this one single issue probably serve as a pretty good guide to somebody's whole approach to phonology, whether or not they think it's worth trying to do English stress with rules or to just basically give up and say, well, English stress is unpredictable. So Hayes gives a rule-based analysis here, which is based on some classic generative phonology work. I'm not sure Hayes actually believes this or not, but here's what he ends up saying. And again, stop me if this sounds familiar. If the second to last syllable, the penult, is light, then we stress the antepenultimate syllable in English. So examples here, regiment, where this j syllable is light, Canada, where the n syllable is light, America, accident, angelus, um, animal, and capital, where all of these have short vowels in them or schwa vowels and no coda consonants. And in particular, the sequences in between the second to last vowel and the last vowel are only characterized by one consonant or zero in all of these words. And so we wouldn't put, for instance, this m consonant in regiment. That wouldn't be parsed as a coda into the preceding syllable. Therefore, that preceding syllable wouldn't be heavy, it would be light. Right? When the penult is closed, that is when it has a coda and is thus a heavy syllable, it attracts stress, as in appendix, dialectal, Columbus, consonantal, ejective, and suspension, where all of these final syllables here, the second to last vowel and the last vowel are separated by consonant clusters in all of these words. So nda, kt, mba, nt, kt, and nsa, all of these, sorry, this is actually nsha, all of these sequences are not possible word beginnings in English. You can't have a word like ndix or ktol or mbus in English. Therefore, the first consonant will need to be parsed into the preceding syllable as a coda. Therefore, that second to last syllable is heavy, and heavy penults are stressed in English. So far, what are we seeing here? Well, it looks the claim here is that English has the Latin stress rule, basically, and it's the same as the classical Arabic stress rule and as the Klamath stress rule, although there are obviously complications in Klamath. Right? So far, Hayes is basically claiming that English has the same stress system as Latin. Right? So likewise, if that penultimate syllable has a long vowel or a diphthong, that also counts as heavy. So this again is just like Latin. What counts as a long vowel? Well, in stress syllables, we get a lot more vowel contrast, and the claim is that any of the tense vowels basically count as long here. So Oklahoma, here, m is an onset of the final syllable. It's not a coda of the penult, but because O is an inherently long tense vowel in English, that counts as a long vowel for the stress system and gets stressed. Similarly, Argentina, that E vowel is the tense one, and it counts as heavy in English. If it were I, the prediction would be that you wouldn't get stressed there. Similarly, the vowel A as in assimilation, O as in opponent, and tense U as in Altoona, which is a town in Pennsylvania about an hour and a half from Morgantown. It's a nice little town. They have an airport there. Okay, so this is the Hayes description of English stress. And great, we live in a systematic stress language just like Latin, and it's totally predictable where the stress is going to fall in any English word. and it follows the exact same rule. So if the second to last syllable is light, then stress the third to last one. Second to last syllable is heavy, then stress it. And if the second to last syllable has a long vowel, it counts as heavy, just like Latin. Right? That said, anybody who's ever tried to pronounce novel English words should be questioning the assumption that stress in English is totally predictable. So this actually happens pretty frequently to me. I like to think it's likely that I have a pretty large vocabulary relative to most English speakers. I have seen some English words in my life, but every once in a while, and like not infrequently, there will be a word that I've seen written but never heard spoken in English or not heard very much, and I try to pronounce it, and I have the wrong stress on these words. This happens all the time. I can only imagine if you're not a native speaker, it's probably even worse, right? So the idea that English stress is totally predictable should already be a little bit suspicious to you. And in fact, if this is the English stress system and these are the rules about how English stress works, then we're going to need to say that there are hundreds and hundreds of exceptions to those rules because this is simply not productive in English in the same way that it might be in Latin or in Klamath. What do I mean here? Well, one thing is that I could plausibly describe English in exactly the opposite way by just choosing different words here, right? And so here is my anti-English stress examples, and I'm going to give the opposite of every rule that Hayes gives, supported by actual English words. Where the penultimate syllable is light, it is stressed. And so here I've chosen words that are one morpheme and have lax vowels in the second to last syllable that are not followed by consonant clusters and that are nonetheless stressed. So abscissa, the second to last syllable here would be si. That is clearly a light syllable. Alabama, second to last syllable here is ba, clearly a light syllable. Rubella, second to last syllable here is be, and again, clearly a light syllable. While this is written with two L's in English writing, that is of course not an actual pronunciation difference. English doesn't have consonant length. This is a normal l sound that's in the onset of the following syllable. Imagine, again, ma is the second to last syllable here. It's stressed, it's light. So yes, there's some words in English that have light penults where the antepenultimate one is stressed. There's also plenty of words with light penults where the light penult is stressed. Here's my second anti-stress principle. Where the penult is heavy, it repels stress. So this one was really fun. So I'm trying to pick words here that can be shown to contain both consonant clusters that can't be syllabified as onsets, and also I'm trying to look for vowels in those second to last syllables here that we know based on other forms, morphologically related forms, are not underlyingly schwa vowels, right? So I show you galaxy, right, where x is not a possible word beginning in English. Therefore, this second to last syllable must have a coda consonant, and maybe you can rescue the Latin stress theory in English by saying, well, yeah, that has a coda consonant, k, but it's underlyingly a schwa vowel. So it just counts as like light anyway, even though there's a coda consonant. But I have cunningly chosen the word galaxy because you can look at related forms of this word, like galactic, and see that in fact, this vowel underlyingly is not a schwa, it's underlyingly an a. Right? So galaxy here, we have an a vowel reducing to schwa and a coda consonant, and yet it is not stressed in penultimate position. Similar here, cylinder, inda, not a possible word beginning in English, so this has to be a coda consonant. We know from the word cylindrical that this is underlyingly a full vowel and not a schwa. Heraldry, where uldra is not a possible word beginning in English, and we know from words like heraldic that this is an underlying full vowel. Adjective, where kt is not a possible word onset in English, and this ject pseudomorpheme is pretty common in English. And here, misanthrope, where again, nthra is not a possible word beginning in English. And we know from other words like anthropic or something like that, that this is a full vowel in the second to last one here. So again, yes, sometimes you find words with heavy penults where the penult is stressed, and other times you find words with heavy penults where the heavy penult is not stressed. And then the last one here, originally we said when the penult has a long vowel or diphthong, it's heavy and attracts stress. When the penult has a long vowel or diphthong, according to the anti-stress generalizations here, it repels stress. So here's again the idea, maniac, where that second to last syllable is unstressed. And you can imagine, well, maybe that's not really a long vowel underlyingly, but we know from related words like maniacal that in fact in the UR, this is a diphthong, I, and it's only surfacing as the shorter vowel E because the stress has been retracted from it, basically. Similarly here, impotent, where this is an O vowel underlyingly, yet it's not stressed. Exponents, where this is an O vowel underlyingly, yet it's not stressed. Immigrant, where this is a I vowel underlyingly, yet it's still not stressed. Endocrine, where this is an O vowel underlyingly, still not stressed. So for every rule or generalization about English stress that you get in this Latin stress system, you can find some words that conform to it. And what I'm trying to show here is you can also find plenty of words that don't conform to these generalizations. That said, these patterns I've picked out here are at least somewhat less common or less frequent in the English lexicon than the ones Hayes gives. Depending on what kind of a corpus you search and how many words it has in it and what you think counts as a word, maybe these patterns that I've chosen are like 20% of English words, and the Hayes ones are 70%, and then 10% just behave totally differently. The exact numbers are going to differ a little bit depending on how you count, but it does seem to be the case that these kinds of patterns are at least easier to find in English than these ones. And so maybe you want to treat all of these words that I've come up with here as exceptions, but that's going to be a lot of exceptions to the extent that you have to wonder, is it useful actually writing stress rules if 20 or 30% of all the words that you run into in the actual language don't work according to those stress rules? Or from the position of the first language learner, of the child acquiring English as an infant or as a child, would you bother generalizing about the stress of this particular 60 or 70% of words if it's going to go against what you're observing with all the other words in your language? Would you even come up with a generalization there? And I'm not sure what the answer to that is, but it's worth pointing out that if English has these kinds of stress rules, they're going to be much, much less productive than in other languages, and there's still going to be a substantial residue of words that you're just going to need to memorize as being exceptions, right? So where do you memorize stuff about specific words in phonological theory? You memorize it in the lexicon. So these are going to have to be listed with stress or with something that predicts stress in the lexicon. In any case, let's say for a moment that we accept this story about English stress. Now we can do the same thing we did in Latin in Klamath and see, hey, if this is the right stress story, then it ought to make predictions about the difference between coda consonants and non-coda consonants, and that should match phonotactic facts about English. Does that work out here? It worked out in Latin, didn't work out in Klamath. What about English? So here are the examples that Hayes gives. Here are some obstruent liquid clusters, and we think that these should all pattern as complex onsets in English because pl, br, tr, cr, gr, qua, sta, and stra are all possible word beginnings in English. And so therefore, if these appear following a penultimate vowel, then they shouldn't force codas into that preceding vowel and into the preceding syllable, and that penultimate syllable should pattern as light. That predicts anti-penultimate stress. So is that right? Discipline. Yeah, it looks like that's right. These two consonants, the pala right, are not in the coda of this penultimate syllable. Therefore, the penultimate syllable si is light. Therefore, anti-penultimate stress on discipline. Panoply. Incidentally, this word, which is a pretty infrequent word in English, is exactly a word of the type that I was talking about earlier, where I've seen this written before, but never really heard it pronounced by anybody. And I was quite surprised to see this. I always thought it was panoply. Um, so turns out, I mean, I guess this is the standard pronunciation. I had learned this the opposite direction, but anyway, he says anti-penultimate stress, and I'm sure that that's the standard pronunciation, panoply, because again, pl is a complex onset, p is not in the coda of the penultimate syllable. The penultimate syllable is light, n, therefore anti-penultimate stress. Similarly, there's illustrations with all these other clusters. So algebra, showing us that the br cluster is a complex onset. Vertebrate. Idolatry, showing us the tr cluster is a complex onset. Symmetry, recalcitrant. Similarly, ludicrous, showing us for cr. For gr, we have sequences like peregrine and integral, and so on and so forth for all of these consonant clusters that are all possible onsets in English. We're seeing that these don't force syllable weight onto the penultimate syllable because they're not introducing coda consonants. Therefore, we get anti-penultimate stress in all these words. What about the cases with things that are not word beginnings? Well, we already saw those up above. These were that was these examples where we have sequences of two consonants here that are not possible word beginnings in English, and we see that these do force the first consonant into the preceding syllable as a coda, and that preceding syllable, the penultimate syllable here, does pattern as heavy and is stressed in these examples. So that's again the Hayes picture of what's going on here. That said, I can think again of lots of examples where this doesn't work out, and so. In particular, can we find examples? I already showed you examples over here of cases where consonant clusters in between the last and second to last vowels can't be syllabified as onsets, yet that second to last syllable is not stressed. So that's already a problem for this theory. What about cases where these sequences can be parsed into an onset and the second to last syllable should be light and should therefore be unstressed? Are there counterexamples to that? Well, here's some examples. Semester, right? St, pretty clearly a possible word beginning in English. Therefore, this sata sequence should be an onset. The second to last syllable here should be meh. It should be light and therefore not stressed, but instead it's stressed. Similarly for disaster, exactly same argument. Psychometric, here tr, possible syllable onset in English, but nonetheless there's penultimate stress here. Allegro, showing us for gra that you can also get counterexamples. Infrequent, qua, possible syllable onset, nonetheless this syllable is behaving as heavy if we believe the stress rule. Simulacrum, right? Cra, possible syllable onset in English. Encyclic, cla, possible onset in English. So again, just like for the stress rules themselves, yes, you can pick out lots of examples from English where phonotactic facts seem to match the syllable structure necessary to do stress. But just as with the stress rules themselves, you can also pick out lots of examples where phonotactic facts don't agree with the syllabifications you would need to do stress according to this Latin stress rule. So my claim here is that either the characterization of stress rules or the characterization of syllable structure or both in English is actually much more complicated and variable and unpredictable than it's presented in the Hayes textbook. That said, it's still worth understanding this analysis of English stress and phonotactics because it is very common. It's sort of a classic analysis in the phonological literature that English basically retains the Latin stress rule. If I had to were forced to make my own theory of this, my guess or my hunch is that the reason you find some of these productive patterns in subparts of the English lexicon is basically because we inherited lots and lots and lots of words from Latin. Those words largely conformed to the Latin stress rule, and so there's like a big part of the lexicon where we have things that look like the Latin stress rule. But because modern English is a mishmash of all sorts of different lexical items, we also have plenty of lexical items that don't conform to the Latin stress rule. Even some words that probably came from Latin in modern English don't conform to the Latin stress rule. So I don't know exactly where the word rubella came from. It's a communicable disease, but it certainly looks like a Latin root, and most medical words use Latin roots. And in Latin, it would make perfect sense for this penultimate syllable to be stressed because there were long consonants in Latin, and this double L in the writing system in Latin that would actually correspond to a geminate consonant, and that would make this penultimate syllable heavy. In contemporary English, that's just not true, right? So there are no long L's, there's no geminate consonants, there's no reason for this second to last syllable to be heavy, yet the stress remains there because it was borrowed from a language where that's where the stress was at some point. And that's the basic idea here is, yeah, we have some sub patterns in the English lexicon because lots of words in the English lexicon came from sources that had productive stress rules, but contemporary English, to me at least, doesn't seem to have much in the way of productive stress rules at all. There's lots and lots of exceptions to all of these. Thank you.